Good morning. This meeting of the February 27th meeting of Senate Finance Committee will come to order. And I want to mention that we invited members of the Human Services and the Health and Human Services committees to join us as well, because the federal impacts on those areas are particularly significant concerns. And anyhow, this meeting is to take a look at federal funds in the state budget. As I think we all on the committee know, we've got a very difficult budget task ahead of us in the next couple months. And the reason for this is that every one of the 50 states has very heavy interactions with federal budgets, and there's some unprecedented things happening there in Washington that I think could have not just a tweaking of our impact on the types of budget issue we have to put together, but could have an overwhelming impact, and small changes could make our problems multiples of times worse. And so we wanted to ask MMB to be here today to give us an update, and I think we have to recognize that we don't know what's going to be happening at the federal level, but there are things happening now that we do know, and so we asked MMB and DHS to give a brief presentation, and then we'll have members welcome to ask questions and so on, and that goes for the Human Services and Health and Human Services members who join us. Anybody at the table is able to ask questions, and we'll have that discussion after the presentation. But to start with, I'd like to invite State Budget Director Mingy and Mr. Greenman from DHS to come to the table, and we've got presentation, I believe, on the screens and also in our packets. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Anna Mingy, State Budget Director with Minnesota Management and Budget. I'm joined today by Dave Greenman, the Chief Financial Officer for the Department of Human Services. Today, we are going to provide an overview of federal funds in the Minnesota state budget, and to make sure that we're clear on the scope. The numbers I'm talking about today are represent the money received by the state of Minnesota, state government. This isn't the totality of funds that are flowing to our state through local governments or private organizations. But you'll see it is still a large and really significant number. I'm going to start by providing an overview of federal funds in the state budget, and then turn to some of the work that MMB is currently doing to monitor what's happening at the federal government, and then turn it over to my colleague to discuss potential changes to our Medicaid program, or to federal Medicaid funding. So first, I'd like to give you all a sense of the magnitude of federal funds administered by the state of Minnesota. So looking just at state fiscal year 2025, which is the year we're currently in, and that ends on June 30th of this year, our state agencies are managing almost 700 federal awards, representing almost $23 billion. On the next slide, I can give you a sense of that in relative to our overall budget. Federal funding represents just over a third of the total dollars that the state is spending in the current biennium. So if you think our total budget across all funds is about $120 billion, federal funds is a third of that. So what is this money paying for? A large proportion of it is supporting state entitlement programs. Programs where state law says an individual is able to receive a benefit or a service based if they meet a set of eligibility criteria. Things like your income level, or your age, or disability status. And so that means that if there's changes at the federal level, there is automatically an impact on our state budget. Sometimes it's a one-to-one replacement. Sometimes it's a little more complicated than that. So of that $23 billion that I discussed in an earlier slide, 56% of it, or just under $13 billion of our 2025 federal awards, support state entitlement spending. Not surprisingly, most of these entitlements are in the health and human services space and in education. And to give you a preview of what you'll hear few minutes, some of the changes being considered to Medicaid, which supports the state medical assistance program, could reduce federal funding in this space by well over $1 billion a year, which would result in higher state general fund spending. So this chart gives you also a sense of what is in that $23 billion. And the point is not to necessarily look at every single box, but to say that Medicaid is by and large the largest federal funding stream flowing to the state of Minnesota, representing more than half of our total federal funding, or almost $12 billion this year. Some other large programs include funding for transportation, SNAP, which is funding or food for families and individuals, Minnesota Care, which is a healthcare program, other child care, public health, housing, and some other programs. So if you think we have almost 700 awards, this table calls out about a dozen specific funding streams, and then everything else is in that all other bucket. That's about $3.3 billion. So there is a lot of work going on at our state agencies to manage those other more than 600 federal awards. So next I'm going to talk about some of these big funding streams in a little bit more detail to give you a sense of the services that they support here in the state. So first, as I previewed, healthcare is a large, receives a lot of federal funding across two programs, primarily medical assistance and Minnesota Care. Medical assistance this year will spend about $11.2 billion in federal funds through Medicaid and then the Children's Health Insurance Program, otherwise known as CHIP. This program covers roughly 1.2 million Minnesotans per month in state fiscal year 2025, and the federal government covers a percentage of state claims, which varies depending on the population that's covered. For most of our program, it's 51% federal share and 49% state share, except for a group known as the expansion population. And this is a group, this is adults without dependent children who don't qualify under a basis of disability. And in that case, the federal government covers 90% of their costs, and the state picks up the remaining 10%. This means, for example, this is about $250 million a year of state costs. It varies from year to year, and then about almost $2.5 billion of federal spending. This, because medical assistance is forecast to grow over the forecast horizon, the amount of federal funding we receive is also set to grow. I'd note we also receive a significant amount of federal administrative funding to support the administration of Medicaid in the state, and that's both for state initiatives and our local partners, particularly counties and tribes. The next program I'd highlight is Minnesota Care. We receive funding under a federal program known as the Basic Health Program, and the funding that flows to the state is calculated based on a percentage of the funding someone would be eligible for in the form of tax credits if they went to purchase health care on MNsure instead. And so the state gets about 95% of those tax credits. The program covers roughly 100,000 Minnesotans, between 138 and 200% of the federal poverty guidelines. And in 2025, we estimate we'll receive spend about $590 million of federal funds for this program. Minnesota is one of just a couple of states that operate a basic health program. So pivoting then to next to some of the big federal funding streams that support children and families in the state, all of these programs are administered by the Department of Children, Youth, and Families. The first, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, otherwise known as SNAP, where the current estimates that we will spend $1.6 billion in fiscal year 2025. This program provides food assistance for over 450,000 Minnesotans with an average benefit of just over $6 a day. The next program is the Child Care Development Block Grant, which is budgeted to spend $553 million this year. Otherwise known as CCDBG, this funding stream supports the federal share of the Child Care Assistance Program, which serves thousands of families every month. It also provides additional support for childcare providers and workers. And then the final program I'd highlight is temporary assistance for needy families, which you will often hear people just call TANF, which is a federal block grant, and we project we'll spend $260 million this year. One program that TANF supports is the Minnesota Family Investment Program, which provides employment support and financial assistance to families living in poverty, and serves about 23,000 families a month, and 70% of the individuals served are children. Another area of state government where we receive significant federal funding is education. So special education is projected to receive $230 million in federal funding, and this reimburses local education agencies, primarily school districts, for a relatively small percentage of the cost of providing special ed services, with state government picking up a large chunk and then local governments funding the remainder. The next bullet, school nutrition services, are in total projected to spend $430 million this year. The federal share of school lunch and breakfast makes up about 75% of that, over $320 million. There are other nutrition programs that provide food services in other settings and for times outside of the usual school calendar. And the final education funding stream that I'll highlight is Title I, which is about $190 million this year. It's mostly providing funding for low-income schools to assess students at risk of not meeting academic standards. So the final large area that I wanted to highlight is transportation, which is projected to spend about $3 billion this year across a variety of spaces: aeronautics, state and local roads and bridges, and then a relatively small piece for transit. So with that, that background, I'll pivot to some of the work that MMB is currently doing to monitor federal changes and actions. So MMB is working very closely with state agencies to identify any disruptions to federal funding or proposed changes. When we hear of a disruption, we work closely with the agency to understand what that means for Minnesotans, who would be impacted, and whether there are alternative funding sources that we could leverage. MMB also is collecting and analyzing incoming federal guidance and new executive orders to understand possible impacts to state funding. At this point in time, a lot of the communication we've received is still not as specific as we would need it to be in order to fully understand the impact to the state. A lot of early executive orders spoke to policy goals and gave direction to agencies to study and come back with recommendations. So in many places, we're still awaiting those recommendations to understand what they really, how they will be implemented at the federal level and what it means for Minnesota. But there have been some disruptions in federal funding, and let me talk a little bit about what that's looked like. So just over 4 weeks ago, as you all are aware, the Office of Management and Budget, the Federal Office of Management and Budget, sent a memo directing state agency or federal agencies to not disperse federal funds, that memo has since been rescinded, but we have seen dozens of state awards disrupted. What does it mean for a funding stream to be disrupted? That has been, we've learned it's a little bit more of an art than a science. Sometimes it's really clear. An agency goes to the federal portal website and they aren't able to access their awards. Other times, agencies have been able to submit a request for reimbursement, but the funding is never deposited or never returned to the state treasury. And then there are other examples where federal partners have notified agencies that awards are under review and they shouldn't spend any more money. As of the evening of February 25th, which I think was 2 days ago, there were 12 state awards where we were unable to access federal funding. 6 were at the Department of Commerce, 4 at the Department of Natural Resources, and 2 at the Department of Agriculture. Of those 12, 10 were awards for appropriations that originated in the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, which is consistent with some of the executive orders that focus specifically on programs in those pieces of federal legislation. I would note that the availability of federal funding is very fluid and status has changed from day to day. And some programs we've had access restored and then later shut off again. We are continuing to hear about state agencies who are being notified that additional programs are under review. So we are just monitoring this very closely and working with our partners across the state enterprise. So those are some changes at the federal level, primarily focusing on already appropriated and obligated dollars. But as we all, or as has been discussed a lot in the news lately, there is potential changes in the congressional level to future federal funding. So the House budget resolution includes $1.5 trillion in specified spending reductions, although they do target $2 trillion in total spending reductions. Of those, $880 billion are in the commerce and energy space. And I note that commerce and energy is the committee overseeing Medicaid. That's, I think, where we expect most of those reductions would occur. There's also $230 billion in the Agriculture Committee. The Agriculture Committee, the largest program in that space is SNAP, which is the food support program that I spoke to earlier in my presentation. The budget resolution doesn't speak to what policies Congress would enact to achieve these savings, but understanding the relationship of the state and the reliance on federal Medicaid funding in particular, we anticipate this could have significant ramifications for the state budget. And while it's important to focus on what's happening in the congressional level, there are also additional uncertain impacts that could happen from changes in federal administrative action. You know, as administrations change, they interpret policies in different ways. There are things like rulemaking that could have a fiscal impact to the state, as well as changes to their approach to things like waivers under our state Medicaid program that could also have a budgetary impact. So, Mr. Chair, that's the end of my first portion. I can turn it over to Mr. Greenman unless you'd like to pause for questions at this point in time.
Senator Drahan, questions now for just briefly here, but we'll wait until after the rest of it. Go ahead.
Can I go through with what's been presented?
Yes, you're welcome to do that. Everything went now. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll just try to stick to that briefly a little bit. It seems like the numbers are off just a little bit on part of the presentation. And the Medicaid on page 5, you know, the numbers compared to page 6 are just off a little bit. Is that just for ease for the presentation? I'm just curious why they're off.
Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator Drahan, for that question, because it's something that that I debated how to communicate. So Medicaid is a federal funding stream that provides funding to multiple state programs. Medical assistance, obviously the largest. So this is the portion of Medicaid and CHIP funding supporting state medical assistance. Most of the delta is in the fifth sub-bullet on slide 6. There's additional funding of almost $600 million a year in administrative funds. So that's the difference between the 11.7 and the $11.2 billion.
So it's the admin, 600 million that we receive from the federal government?
Yep, it's the admin.
Thank you, Chair, and I have a couple more if I
Go
could.
ahead, please continue.
Yep, thank you. On the slide that you have up right now, thank you, Chair, the 880 and the 230, that is over what time period? That's a 10-year time period for these proposed changes, correct?
Mr. Chair, Senator Drahan, yes, that's correct. Thank you.
So that just want to make sure everybody's clear on that. And I think the intent is to go to pre-COVID budget numbers. So that's why they're trying to cut $2 trillion, just so everybody understands that. And then, find my, I had one other question. Out of the 12 on the previous slide, out of the almost 700 programs, 12 were not funded in the last month, more or less. How many have been resolved of those 12?
Mr. Chair, Senator, so there have been, 12 is the number of programs that are essentially currently disrupted.
And when you, I'm sorry, Chair, when you say disrupted, that means a total non-payment, a partial payment, canceled, what does that mean?
So, Mr. Chair, so far, no awards have been canceled. It represents non-payments, partial payments, communication that agencies shouldn't seek reimbursement, so it represents a variety of things.
Continue.
Now, is that common? My impression of government, it doesn't always flow correctly. So how many times a year do you experience partial payment or pauses? I've read multiple times in the previous couple years that programs have been delayed. Here in our own state government, in the housing, we had 3 programs that we've been waiting 2 years to get out the door. And when the nonprofits went to talk to them, they said there was a liquidity issue at the agency. So here in our own state, we have problems getting money out the door. So I don't, to me, it isn't uncommon to have some delays in government. But can you address how often this happens from the federal government to the state?
Director Mingy.
Mr. Chair, Senator, I can't speak to there being never any delays in payment from the federal government, but I think we can say with confidence that the inability to access payment portals, especially at the magnitude to which we have seen in the last month, as well as communication from federal agencies to stop spending for awards that have been obligated at the federal level with signed contracts with state agencies. This has been a sort of a significant departure from what we're used to experiencing.
I'll save the rest.
Okay,
Thank
and
you.
I want to follow up on one part of that. I spoke with one of our social service providers, LSS, the other day, and they said that their normal delay of payments is they do work in October, they'd be getting reimbursed for now, and they're told they may not be getting that, I think, from the federal government. Is that's one of these unresolved things? We hope that the work they've done, I mean, they were told stop doing the work, but I believe they're saying we're not going to get reimbursed for the previous stuff either. Is that the nature of what you're saying, what you call a disruption, or?
Mr. Chair, that is some of what we're seeing. In some cases, it's grants that are earlier in their implementation, so there isn't as much money that's actually been spent. In some cases, it is reimbursement that the state has requested for services that were rendered sort of months ago. We are working through some of this with the federal government. For example, there is a program where our federal partners have said, please revise your invoice to include only costs incurred January 19th and earlier, and then all the costs January 20th and later are under review. So some of that is, I think you're right that it is in some cases reimbursement for costs for services that have been delivered, more than a month ago, but it is something that's very fluid.
Okay, thank you, and appreciate that. The other thing I wanted to say, follow up something Senator Draheim sent, and that is that one slide, your 12th slide on the potential changes, the 1.5 trillion is over a decade. The other numbers are over 1 year, and I think we got to keep in mind, we do 2-year budgets, so when you're talking about the 11.2, 11.7 billion that's spent in Medicaid dollars in our biennial budget for the next biennium, it's twice that much. In other words, we're talking 25 billion, almost 24 billion. we're talking that kind of dollars in our budget if they would shut that off, which is they're not talking about doing, but even a slight tweak in that is twice as big in our budget as it would look here.
Mr. Chair, that's right. So the numbers, that $23 billion is an annual number, and similarly, the 11.2 we have for Medicaid is an annual number. Mr. Greenman will have some numbers about how do we contextualize that $880 billion in Medicaid cuts. If we tried to identify how much of that's flowing to Minnesota.
That's helpful. I just wanted to clarify that. And before we move on, I have Senator Pappas and Gruenhagen, then Murphy.
Mr. Chairman, I have several questions, but I'm happy to wait until after Mr. Greenman's presentation, if you prefer. I'm happy to do that.
It's up to you if we can take it now. Senator Gruenhagen.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I just got a couple comments that you could respond to, Director Mingy. First off, I happened to catch the President Trump news conference yesterday with his agency heads, and he was asked directly about Medicare and Medicaid in terms of reduction of funding. And his response was that they're only going to look for waste, fraud, and abuse, that people on Medicaid are going to continue to get their checks of people in need, but they are going to audit things and look for waste, fraud, and abuse. The other thing, they, just in the Social Security area alone, we now know that 6.4 million Social Security numbers are floating around out there. We don't know if they're getting checks or not, and that's people 112 and older, some of them 150 years old. So I think there is room to get rid of the waste, fraud, and abuse. And so the other comment I would just make, and then you could respond, the other comment that was made, my understanding, if a state gets rid of their DEI, okay, their gender-affirming care, and their Green New Deal scam, which I've been waiting for 20 years for a president to say that, and cooperates with Mr. Holman in terms of getting rid of the criminal illegal immigrants, rapists, murderers, drug dealers that are killing tens of thousands of our young people, you do those few things, and my understanding is you're going to get your funding. Would you disagree with that, or what are your thoughts?
Director Mingy.
Mr. Chair, Senator Gruenhagen, I'm not able to speak to what, and I think we don't know yet what policies the Congress would include to achieve these savings targets. I think Mr. Greenman will talk about some of the significant ones that do generate large amounts of savings. And in terms of the other conditions on federal funding, I think that's not something I'm able to speak to at this point in time.
Mr. Chair, just one
Senator
follow-up.
Gruenhagen.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, these are all signed executive orders by President Trump. And he has said time and again, if you cooperate with this, you'll get your federal funding. And if not, there's going to be problems. So just something to think about. Thank you.
Senator Murphy, then Senator Friends, then we got the others. Keep going, Senator Murphy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just responding now to Senator Gruenhagen, and I have heard the waste, fraud, and abuse, especially with regard to the now emerging position of the Republicans out in Washington, D.C., and it's, what they're proposing to do with their budget. And so I did a little bit, I didn't do the math, I asked for a little bit of math. And if we combine the state and federal budget, what we've seen thus far in terms of waste, fraud, and abuse totals like 0.2% of the budget, which doesn't amount to anything near what we might see coming from the federal government in terms of cuts. So I appreciate the talking point, but real human Minnesotans are, going to experience or might experience some things when we balance the budget, Senator Gruenhagen. So I just wanted to make sure and put that into context. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, my name was mentioned. Could I just have a quick response?
Go ahead, Senator Gruenhagen.
Oh, thank you, Senator Marty. Mr. Chairman. Yeah, well, they've only been in office a month, Right now, according to U.S. Debt Clock, it totals over, I think, $190 billion of savings ongoing. And that's just 1 month. Their target is $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion this year. And I think they'll reach it, to tell you the truth.
Senator Friends.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Mengy, for the presentation. We're here because the state of Minnesota is concerned about what's going on in Washington, D.C. To my good friend, Senator Gruenhagen, I hear you talking about waste, fraud, and abuse. That's not what the House budget resolution that passed says. It does not say, unless we can't find more waste, fraud, and abuse. It says that dollar figure, and this director is here saying, we're very concerned. There is no way to reach that type of cuts without hitting Medicaid, so that the state of Minnesota is now asking, how concerned are we? And I think what I hear MMB saying is we're very concerned. And I would say to all of us, part of my concern is the broken promises. Scott County, where my good friend Senator Pratt serves, has a $10 million project approved, funded, contract signed, and now frozen. I wonder what the people of Minnesota in general and our partners in particular are going to say if we go around freezing funds, not because we see waste, fraud, and abuse, but because we feel like it. And what will the next group of contractors say to the state of Minnesota or the United States of America when we say, please enter into this contract with us? We promise you'll get paid. I'm also looking at the local tax impact of that particular $10 million potentially in Ramsey, Washington, and Scott County. That's a $100 million project critical to our waste management needs. And I have the funny feeling that if the federal government doesn't come through on that $10 million, that they're going to be looking to the local taxpayers. And I just want all of us to keep in mind, it's one thing to say, here's how we should go forward, here's the spending choices and cuts we should make. It's quite another to say, yeah, we made this promise and these contracts have been signed, but we're going to freeze them or potentially avoid them altogether. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, members.
Mr. Chair, my name was mentioned again. Could I have a quick response?
Go ahead, Senator Gruenhagen.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for that response, Senator Friends. Yeah, I would just say all they passed is a framework. A lot of the preemptive concerns or scare is simply that. We don't know for sure yet. Both the Senate and the House have to come to an agreement. And again, according to the conference with all the agency heads there, President Trump said that Medicaid and Medicare are not going to be reduced, but they are going to look for waste, fraud, and abuse. Now, again, it's politics. We know this is shifting sand, so we'll see what happens. And there's nothing wrong with preparing for it, but I think if we get in cooperation with the executive orders, a lot of the federal funding will flow through to Minnesota. Thank you.
Senator Champion, then Senator Draheim, then Senator Mohammed, and Senator Bolden. We get a longer list. So
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the words, and I think are true from my good friend, Senator Friends. Senator Gruenhagen, I think, what you've stated is something that is a fallacy. And the reason why I'm saying it's something of a fallacy, because I don't think, with all due respect, that you're connecting all the dots. If this work was only about fraud and waste, then there would have been a thorough evaluation of the system where there could potentially be waste. That didn't happen. You said it's only been 30 days. Well, there's a number of things that happens usually when you first get someplace. You do an assessment in order to see where you are. You don't just come in and just start cutting people. In fact, when we think in terms of our federal employees, without even understanding what they do, they're dismissed. And not only are they dismissed, they're dismissed without warning or any evaluation. In fact, it is within these 30 days that even individuals who oversee our nuclear arsenal has been dismissed because of just the knee-jerk reaction that's happening with the assistance of someone who is not even a federal employee, namely Elon Musk. So when you think in terms of the work that they're doing and the actions that they're taking, it doesn't appear to be thoughtful. It just appears to be, I'm going to use a hammer just because I have it, and it doesn't matter who I'm going to hurt. Another place, federal funds that were frozen. With those same executive orders that you're talking about, there were federal funds frozen that affected veterans, other people all around the nation, Medicare, Social Security benefits, you name it. That wasn't because of fraud. In fact, there was no assessment at all. And so what I'm saying to you is that as we look at things, we're being much more thoughtful than they're being in Washington, D.C. We're at least looking, asking questions, trying to get a real sense of where we are and what makes sense. Not to mention, I'm certain that you will speak to this, Senator Gruenhagen, that there were farmers who also came forward and said, hey, where is our supplement? Where are the federal funds that we're supposed to receive as farmers? Farmers are just on the long list of casualties that we've seen, all in the name of someone saying we are doing it because there's waste, fraud, and abuse. And if that is true, you show me where it is.
Mr. Chair, my
Senator
name was
Gruenhagen,
mentioned again. Thank you. Senator Champion, in all due respect, a lot of what you just said is fallacy, unfortunately. Those executive orders are facts, and that's what they're looking for. They've been in a month, and we're over 36, headed to 37 trillion in debt in the general fund alone, $1 trillion worth of interest. It's time to have an overhaul, or the people we're trying to help are going to suffer much worse when we hit a wall of financial bankruptcy. So with that, if you don't mention my names, I won't respond.
Senator Marty,
Senator Champion.
if you just give me just one moment, I'm sorry. Senator Gruenhagen, with all due respect, I hold you in high esteem, and I just want you to know that the things that you're saying seems to be on a bumper sticker, and perhaps it's a part of a note that you have, so you want to stay on message, but the message is off. Because if what you're saying is true, that we want to protect people, then where have we been protecting people in the last 30 days? You can't say you want to protect people, but it's this fallacy of these people in your mind that you're not helping at all. And when we think in terms of helping people, it is giving them the financial support that they need to go forward, for people to be able to have health care, and our kids to have health care, and for our farmers to have the benefits that they're looking for our veterans to have the support that they need. Where are they in the equation? It appears when we say fraud and abuse, those are provocative words that we're just using in order to make it sound good. But in fact, the people who are being hurt are everyday Americans and Minnesotans who just want to live their life in order to do what's right. So I will not call your name again so you can speak again. And I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, because
Mr. Chair.
I just think that what he's saying doesn't quite line up with the reality that we all have been experiencing. And in fact, I need to check my phone to see if anything else has happened within the last 5 minutes.
Okay, he did mention my name again. I'll just quick
You
respond.
can have one more, and then we're going to move on because of what.
Thanks for your grace, Mr. Chair. Yeah, Senator Champion, you know I hold you in esteem also, okay? And we both want what's best. But basically, what I'm referring to is executive orders that have been factually signed and implemented. What you're saying is simply projection, a lot of which is fallacy, okay? That there's not one person in the state of Minnesota that I know of that hasn't received their medical assistance, okay, yet. Now, is there some concern on the horizon? Yes. But to say that that's going to happen and those people aren't receiving anything, that simply is a fallacy. Thank you.
I would like to, I have several others I have on the list, 4 more, but I'd like to get back to the presentation, which has more on human services. I'll ask the 4 of you who have had your hands up that we're ready to call on, if it's okay to keep going. Okay. We'll continue with Mr. Greenman, and then we'll get back to them. And I do have 4 of you, Sir Mohammed, Draheim, Bolden, and Wicklund on the list for when we get back to questions. So please continue, Mr. Greenman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Dave Greenman. I'm the Chief Financial Officer with the Department of Human Services. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're seeing in terms of actions at the federal level and the potential implications for Minnesota with regard to Medicaid in particular. The first slide really just looks at what Medicaid means to Minnesota, what the impact it has on Minnesota. As Ms. Mingy mentioned earlier, more than 1 in 5 Minnesotans have received services through Medicaid. They're enrolled in Medicaid, including 42% of the children in the state. Medicaid also pays for 1/2 of all long-term care services delivered in Minnesota throughout the state. In addition to the people Medicaid serves, it provides about $20 billion a year in payments, most of which go to providers in the state, throughout the state. So it in a sense, it's also it's an economic, it has an economic impact in the state as well. And it does provide about $600 million in administrative funding, some of which goes to DHS, but much of which goes to counties to help them with costs for administering programs such as DHS, or such as medical assistance. As Ms. Mingy mentioned earlier, there are different rates at which the federal government covers Medicaid services in the state. Overall, she mentioned there was a 50% is around, it's around 50% for the regular Medicaid, and then there's a higher match rate for the expansion group. Overall, it's about 57% of Medicaid spending is funded by the federal government. And I think one other thing to note is that federal Medicaid spending accounts for 17% of all state spending. When you look just beyond if you expand all spending beyond the general fund to all dollars, it's 17% of state spending. Yeah, can you, thanks. So, as we've all noted, there is the situation at the federal level. It's complicated and fluid, and there's been a lot of conversations going on. We know that a budget resolution passed in the House that directs the committee that oversees Medicaid to find reductions equal to $880 billion. That committee's oversight includes, in addition to Medicaid, it includes Medicare. It doesn't include a lot else. Those two are the major programs funded in that committee. It isn't clear. I mean, we haven't. That's true. It's true that the budget resolution does not include any policy proposals. It's silent on that. So it's basically directing the committee to develop how to actually achieve those savings. And it's not clear how much Medicaid would need to be cut in order to hit a target like that. Just without looking at what the committee's jurisdiction and what it funds, I think it's not unreasonable to say that $600 billion might be the low end and $880 might be the high end. This would amount to about an 8 to 12% reduction in the federal Medicaid outlays nationwide. If those cuts were distributed proportionally across all states, Minnesota could see a reduction of $1 to $1.6 billion in fiscal year 27, and that number would grow over time. It's important to note, as was mentioned earlier, that this is going to be a long process. There's going to be a lot of negotiating. The House or the Senate's going to have its position. Its budget resolution currently calls for smaller cuts. But one reason for that is that they have a two-step process, and they're not paying for as much in this budget reconciliation bill as the House is. So we will see a second budget or second piece of legislation or spending package coming from the Senate that may include additional reductions. There's obviously ways to go in this process, and we have yet to see proposals, but we are aware of some ideas that have been floated in the House and Senate. So several options include what we've been hearing about most frequently would be per capita caps and block grants on Medicaid. Right now, Medicaid, the federal government funds Medicaid as mandatory spending. That means that if somebody's enrolled in the program and a payment is made to a provider, the Department of Human Services draws down the federal match based on what the federal match rate is and what services are provided. A per capita cap would limit the amount of spending that states could do for Medicaid, or at least it limit the amount of spending that the federal government would match. Depending how that would be structured, that could have a pretty significant impact on Minnesota, because Minnesota pays more per person per month than most other states. In fact, there's, I think, only one other state in the District of Columbia spends more on a per member per month basis. Another option would be to eliminate the enhanced FMAP on the expansion group. That would be the group that was added during the ACA that Ms. Minky mentioned earlier. This would be adults without children. She mentioned earlier the match rate right now for the federal government is 90%. It would go down to about the current match rate. Normal match rate's about 51% at this point. So that would be a significant shift in the cost of Medicaid from the federal government to the states, because we would have to pick up the difference. I think the other one that we've been hearing about more often is work requirements, and that would again, we don't know what that would look like yet, but we have seen something similar in the past. It would essentially set some criteria for Medicaid enrollees who meet certain criteria would be required to engage in either work or community activity for a certain amount of time, and to verify that they do that. As I mentioned, we have that has come up in the past. Previously in the last Trump administration, that at that time that option was for a waiver, and it had a number of significant administrative requirements attached to it in terms of determining whether people met the criteria to work or not, whether they were working or not. It had a lot of oversight attached to it. When we looked at that in Minnesota, I think there was a proposal to do that. The other thing we saw when we looked at that is that those people who would be subject to work requirements, many of them were the adults without children. Some of that population could actually qualify as disabled, and that we would expect certain portion of that population to shift to that disability group, which would have at that time exempted them from work requirements. So it was pretty difficult to determine what the impact that would have had on Minnesota. And I think the other point to make about work requirements is that that would produce, according to projections we've seen, relatively little in the way of savings at the federal level. So I've just walked through 3 of them. There's several other ones that are out there, looking at other reductions or adjustments to the FMAP rate, looking at administrative funding for the Medicaid program. DHS is closely monitoring these potential proposals to try to better understand what that impact might be on Minnesota. Of course, without language, without knowing exactly what the proposals are going to be, we can't put a precise price tag on any of them. But we're very concerned about what the impacts of these proposals might be. One that we can project with some accuracy would be the loss of the enhanced FMAP for the expansion population, and that would result in a loss of between $1.2 and $1.3 billion a year to the state. As we continue to think and work on these things, we will continue to watch what the federal government's doing, and continue to monitor these and work to determine how we can respond. I'll turn it over to Ms. Mingy for the close.
Thank you, Ms. Mingy.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. So to sort of summarize, the sort of unclear guidance that we have to date from the federal government, as well as inconsistent access to current grant agreements with the federal government, as well as uncertainty about the federal budget, creates a lot of some challenges and uncertainty for both state agencies and policymakers like you. I think it's important to know that regardless of how this conversation evolves at the federal level, the upcoming budget forecast, it's a week from today, will not incorporate any of the proposed changes to federal spending that could result from congressional actions. So should Congress enact and the president sign a budget bill that effectuates changes to state reimbursement of any level, that is not something that we will seek to anticipate in the budget forecast. It's something that we will need to work together to monitor and evaluate as the session evolves. But I think it's safe to say that the loss of billions of dollars in federal Medicaid funding would significantly impact the state's financial position. So the example that Mr. Greenman provided, if Congress enacted a change in the federal share for adults without children, that's about $1.2 to $1.3 billion a year, so about $2.5 billion a biennium, which is not something that the general fund is able to absorb without changes to the remainder of the budget. So with that, Mr. Chair, we're happy to take questions.
Thank you, and thank you both for the presentation. Yeah, one of the reasons we wanted to have this hearing before the budget forecast is your point in the last slide about how the upcoming forecast obviously cannot know what's going to happen going forward at the federal level, but as you said, that just the loss of the enhanced FMAP, that $2.5 billion a biennium, we're looking, when we're talking about the $1.9 billion problem 4 years out, this would be basically tripling that if you count the next biennium and so on. So it triples that, just that one change would. So that's why, even though we don't know how this is all going to play out, I think it's pretty important that we be preparing for it, because it's troubling if so. I'm going to get back to the list we had. There are a lot of names on it, and I'm sure there will be more as well. I'll add Senator Day, but we're going to start with Senator Mohammed, then people can prepare. Senator Draheim, Senator Bolden, Senator Wickland, Senator Pappas, Senator Pappas, you had asked earlier and you stepped up.
Mr. Chairman, I delayed my comments from earlier, so
Yes.
I actually thought I was at the top of the list.
You can be at the top of the list now.
Oh, great. Thank you. Yes, Director Mingy, so I have concerns about what these federal cuts could mean to our ability to meet the over $8 billion in deferred maintenance we have in the state through our state capital investment or bonding bill. And so any kind of information about cancellations or delays in funding for state roads and bridges, for local roads and bridges, this is all going to be very, very significant, because this high amount of money, $800 million for roads and bridges, $500 million for local roads and bridges, we don't do anything like that between the capital investment bill and the transportation bill. So that's very concerning to me. The other issue that I'm also very concerned about is our Public Facilities Authority for wastewater and clean water and our revolving loan program. It's my understanding that if we appropriate $39 million, that would unlock $215 million from the feds. That potentially could be at risk, because now that has been rolled into IIJA. So if IIJA funding, which also funds, I think, our roads and bridges, is at risk at all, that impacts our ability to help local communities throughout the state with their extreme needs in terms of wastewater and clean water, which we're already struggling to meet. One other example I just wanted to share is the Crookston at the U of M has an aging HVAC system, aging coal burning furnace. Coal is being obviously phased out. If they were to purchase another coal burning furnace that lasts 25 or 30 years, they probably wouldn't have any kind of replacement parts for it. They're counting on tax credits from the IRA in order to do a biothermal at Crookston. If the IRA is threatened, I mean, that's just one of many projects that I'm very concerned about. So any information you or our federal infrastructure person, Leah Carey, is her last name, Leah Carey has, we really need to be kept up to date on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Senator Mohammed?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is on slide 4. You talk about $12.8 billion of our federal funds in 2028 support the state's entitlement spending. Can you elaborate what the recent federal freezes and possible cuts mean for our state's budget and how that's going to impact our February forecast?
Mr. Chair, Senator Mohammed, so the funds that are currently on hold are not those in the entitlement space. They're more grants related to your grants at DNR, Commerce, and the Department of Agriculture. However, the bulk of the cuts being discussed at the federal level and congressional action would directly impact some of our state entitlement programs, most significantly medical assistance. So if there was a reduction in federal Medicaid funding without a corresponding change in state law that changed the benefits we provide people or who is eligible for programs, the state would need to pick up some of those costs to the, potentially to the tune of, $1.2 to $1.6 billion a year, as Mr. Greeman noted.
Follow-up into that, I think in terms of the freezes, right now, folks are talking about logging into the portal and that not working. I think Senator Draham mentioned how it's been a little bit frustrating with our state agencies, and that could be a possible reason at the federal level. Has that happened in the past when it comes to federal funding, or is this the first time you're seeing this?
Mr. Chair, Senator, I don't want to say that this has absolutely never happened. I can't speak with that level of certainty. I do think that the scope and the duration in the last month has been different than anything we have experienced in the past.
Thank you. Senator Draheim.
Thank you, Chair Marty. And thank you both for the testimony and the information. I think it's really important that we all understand the what ifs. And I hope, Chair, we could do a what if with the impact of the proposals to our local communities. And, I met with 5 of my 7 counties recently, and they're very concerned about the proposed cuts from Governor Walz and this shift. It's hundreds of millions of dollars, plus what we've already done in the last couple of years to them. And, I think this is helpful. I always like having these hearings, so I do appreciate the topic and the discussion. But if we could get back to the list of 12, is it possible we could get, Chair, a list of what these 12 programs are with the dollar amounts on them and what the programs are and where the money is supposed to be coming from?
Ms. Mengy.
Mr. Chair, Senator Draheim, we can provide that to the committee.
Chair?
If you can provide them to him and the whole committee, we'd like to see it, yeah. Senator Draheim.
Thank you, and thank you for the willingness to share that. I just want to comment on some of this stuff without going back and forth and having the tit for tat in the committee here. It was mentioned about Musk and having an outside person involved in some of the activity that is going on in D.C., which I think is kind of ironic that we had a former president that couldn't find his way off a stage. And we're worried about one of the smartest people, like him or not. He is a brilliant individual. We've had John Kerry in the White House and at cabinet meetings. Here in Minnesota, we had the Attorney General's office having attorneys work in their office that were paid from a billionaire from out east. So, I don't think we can, throw stones in a glass house on that. The fallacy comments, we can go through a lot of the programs that I think they're trying to accomplish in DC that I think 3/4 of the population support. I think the percentage is 76% of the population supports the efforts to try to uncover waste, fraud, and abuse. But I think RV stations, or the charging stations, excuse me, something that Senator French worked hard on here in Minnesota, getting the electric clean energy passed through. You know, on the federal level, we spent billions and only got a handful of stations across the country. The wise Mr. Nallman, as always, you know, whispered in my ear a little bit about some of the discussion we're having here, and one of the questions I had, and I think it's helpful for us to understand the process. So I think they're totally different, but this would like be a target to committees over a 10-year period. So this isn't gonna happen. It's a what if. And I think that's worthy to have, especially here in Minnesota when we're facing a 5 to 6, and numbers I heard yesterday were $7 to $9 billion deficit coming up. We need to have some discussions on what if. But I look at the proposal here in Minnesota from the governor, and we're proposing a $1.5 billion cut to Health and Human Service at a time where our aging population, that the people 65 and older from 2000 to 2030 are going to double. We're in 2025. They're here. And they're going to require more assistance. You know, we have proposed cuts for education for almost $500 million. Bonding was mentioned, and the proposal from the governor is cutting transportation over $128 million. And I can go on and on and on. And what the scary part is, you know, we're worried about what the federal government might or might not do. But the track record with our current governor is that most of his budget gets adopted. It wasn't like when I first came in 9 years ago, Senator French, Senator Eichhorn came in at the same time. Back then, we worked on our own budget. The House and the Senate worked on our own budget and then passed it on to the governor, the way it's supposed to be. But under recent years, it seems like we pretty much adopt the governor's proposals. And in that governor's proposal this year, we're cutting behavioral health funding, which is important to me, obviously, the other three that we talked about, and then we're shifting all this burden onto our counties. So I'm really concerned. My little county of LeSueur County is going to have to raise property taxes if the proposals go through 10%. And you guys know how passionate I am about housing and all the calls I get from seniors that can't afford to stay in their house because insurance costs too much and the property taxes cost too much. So I think we got to work together. I don't think the blame game solves anything. So I hope, Chair, we can have a hearing on kind of a local impact and what it's going to do to our counties, at least, if we don't want to drill down more on that, on budget proposals. I know we will get busy next week, and I'm excited for that. But I think we're looking for a headline here and a distraction. And I think we should be looking in our own mirror. We have our own problems here that we have to work through together. It has to be a bipartisan solution. And, you know, Senator Murphy, I don't envy you on what you have coming forward with trying to land this plane here with the big deficit coming. And I hope we will take a big bite out of the apple in this first biennium on that proposed or that pending deficit. So I could ramble all day, Marty, Chair Marty, but thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to go first to the members who have not had a chance to speak. I have, and they're next on the list, coincidentally, Senator Bolden, Senator Wickland, and Senator Dames.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the invitation to join as a member of the Health and Human Services Committee, as this information is directly relevant to the work that we are and will be doing in that committee. I appreciate this conversation. I appreciate the presentation. As we do the work this session to build a state budget, this is important information for us to consider. The decisions that are being made at the federal level will have a direct impact on our decisions and our ability to build that state budget. And, as we are having this discussion and, thinking about the reality of what we are seeing from the federal government and what Minnesotans are seeing, I'm thinking about the chaos and the cruelty and the corruption that we are seeing at that level. The chaos, as you describe about, not having access to the streaming funds, there's 12 right now, that number could change. I appreciate getting that information, but I think about how difficult it is for staff to, not know, am I going to be able to draw down these funds? Am I not? Is this program going to work today? Is it not? And the impact that has potentially on Minnesotans and the services that they need. And I want to be clear about what we're talking about. The numbers of, $880 billion in potential cuts to Medicaid. I have severe concerns about that, as do many Minnesotans. And that's not just numbers on a spreadsheet. That is care for people. That is seniors. That is children. That is people with disabilities. That is care that people need and deserve. And there is no way to have $880 billion of cuts at that level and not have it affect people and their care. That is absolutely what will happen. And the cruelty of that and the corruption of those decisions being made by an unelected billionaire, richest man in the world, president's top campaign donor, who does not have the authority to make those decisions, who is checking boxes on which payments will go out and which ones won't, and who will have a job and who won't, and he doesn't have the authority to even make those decisions. But that's what's happening. That's what we are seeing, and that's what Minnesotans are experiencing. And so we have a responsibility to build that state budget, to be sure that we are making sure that people have access to the care that they need, that they have access to stable housing and education and all of the things that communities need to thrive. That is what Minnesotans are calling on us to do. And so this information is important, and we need to take that into consideration as we, do our work. And I hope that we are, can all get on the same page of what the reality is and what we are seeing and what is our responsibility for Minnesotans. So I guess with that, I'll just end with a question. The Medicaid piece is very concerning to me, as and we are getting questions from Minnesotans about, I have a child on Medicaid, has, services. Do I need to start making plans for, to do something different? And so you noted that the potential changes that are moving through Congress has the potential to cut Medicaid funding by over $1 billion per year. And so if that were to happen, what would that look like? What kind of a gap does that create in state funding? Can we make that up? What does that mean for Minnesotans? How many Minnesotans would lose services if that were to happen? What would that look like?
So, Mr. Chair, Senator Bolden, unfortunately, there's not an easy answer to how do we solve. I think there's an easy answer to can the state budget absorb a loss of $1 billion of federal Medicaid funding a year. The answer is no, we don't have a balance large enough to absorb that change. The question really will come to policymakers to say, how do we bridge that gap? Is it through, there are options to make spending reductions within medical assistance, things like provider rates, eligibility, covered services, and all of that, as you mentioned, does impact our our economy and the residents of Minnesota. But there are also options to reduce spending in other areas. The biggest area of the state budget this upcoming biennium is education. With education, health, and human services collectively make up about 3/4 of the state budget. Then another option would be to look at changes in state revenue. So it's really it's the changes on spending or revenue, and up to policymakers to figure out how that lands.
Senator Borg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll end and let others speak, but I guess I also just want, so thank you for that. And also just want to address the, we had a bit of conversation about sort of increased needs and could we, go back to lower levels of spending. And I want to be clear that, the spending and the resources are because people need those resources. People need Medicaid coverage. People need SNAP benefits. And the reason that that is increasing is because we continue to extract wealth from the middle class and hand it over to billionaires and the uber rich of this country. And that is part of this budget as well, tax cuts for the uber rich. And so, as we continue to squeeze the middle class and make things more difficult for them, that is part of our work in building a budget as well, to be sure that everyone has access to the care that they need, so that, so folks can pay for childcare and housing and all the things that, allow us to thrive in our lives. Everyone should be able to afford their life. And, the decisions that are being made to transfer that wealth to the uber rich is making that more and more difficult for people. And that is why more and more services are being needed. So I want us to keep that in mind of sort of why these things are happening as we are moving forward. And we've got some difficult decisions in front of us, and the chaos and uncertainty makes it even more difficult. So I appreciate this information. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Wicklund, then Senator Dames.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I also really appreciate having this presentation today. It really helps us to fill in some of the numbers, helps us realize, the impacts that changes could have on significant budgets that we are going to have to be considering. We have already been doing some thinking about the budget that we need to create for the HHS committee in terms of what we were facing before we knew about some of these potential cuts. And that was going to be a significant challenge for us to do that, because there are still many needs in the Health and Human Services area that we are not meeting. We had a hearing yesterday in my committee about increasing provider rates, because many providers are simply not receiving enough reimbursement to cover their costs. So we know there are current needs. And one of the items that you've brought forward, this possible loss of the enhanced matching funding for the adults without children group, that loss of $2.5 billion each biennium would be an incredible strain on our budget. And I don't know how we would be able to cover that without, as you mentioned, looking for ways to reduce coverage or eliminate some benefits or reduce the below payments to providers that we just, as I mentioned, already know that providers are strained and unable to, to be able to bear those low reimbursement rates. I mean, Medicaid right now is, it covers more people in the state than Medicare. We have more children. We have over 550,000 children that are covered by Medicaid. Significant cuts that will affect them, mean that children maybe, we lose the benefits of having health care coverage, like better attendance in school. They're better able to focus if they're able to receive health care when they need it. We see studies that show that better access to health care means lower high school dropout rates. Really important things to our economies. And this is all across our state. As your slide showed, we have over 20% of the population in all regions of the state, up to like 28% of the population within the kind of northwest region of the state are enrolled in Medicaid. So cuts to benefits or needing to adjust the provider rates, that will affect local economies all across our state, providers not taking in as much income, hospitals not taking in as much income. We know that hospitals are stressed all across our state. So I'm really concerned about what we're looking at. Obviously, we have to keep following as Congress considers, their options and what moves forward. But I think, we have to seriously look at what this would mean and consider what choices we might have to make as we plan for the actual budget that we have to come forward with in a few weeks. So I'm really hope that people are, aware that this not only affects people who have Medicaid coverage, but it will affect communities who all depend on providers and hospitals and depend on people being able to contribute to the local economies. So thank you again, and I hope that, as we go forward, that we can continue to have regular updates about what you're hearing from Washington. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Wicklund. I have three Senator Dames first, I'm sorry.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair and members, and thank you, folks, for doing your presentation today. We certainly appreciate it. I think we need to be aware of some of the things that are happening, but I think we also have to be aware of what's happening in the state of Minnesota. And it seems to me like a lot of what we've been seeing, every committee is having talks about what this effect is going to have on them, and I think that's fine. But I think in that process, we're starting to lose oversight of what we're really here for. And one of that things we're here for is to do the budget for the next year, the next biennium. It's quite interesting if you go back and you look at history and start with about 2011 when that budget was put together for that upcoming biennium, and look at the end of the last biennium. That period of years, the budget grew less in the total combined number of years than it did for this current budget. And it grew considerably less in that number of years than the current budget. So we take a look at the November forecast, a forecast of roughly a $5 billion deficit on the cliff in 2 years. Now there's rumors floating around, and rumors are rumors. We really don't know what the budget is going to be on next Thursday. But let's, and I appreciate, Director, I appreciate your pointing out that the conversation we're having today is not an influence on that forecast. And so that forecast will show what has happened due to what we spent in the last couple of years compared to the previous several bienniums before that. So let's keep in mind where we're at, and we're going to have to make some very tough decisions, because there's going to be some legislators that are going to say, let's just kick the can down to the next biennium and we'll deal with this big deficit then. Reality is we have to deal with that deficit in this budget period. And so I hope that our various agencies are looking at their agencies and seeing where there can be some cuts made that will be the least, that'll put the least harm on what we do in the state of Minnesota. And I hope that you're requesting them, Director, to do that. I also hope that these agencies are taking a look at the fraud and abuse that's going on in Minnesota and does whatever they can to get a handle on that and slow it down. And when agencies come to the committee and ask for more dollars to control fraud and abuse, we better back up and start thinking. Because when you have fraud and abuse at an agency and you have to hire more people to find it, I think we've got a little bit of problem, but that's a conversation for another day. But I appreciate what we're doing here, folks. There's a lot of talk here. Some of this may happen, some may not happen. But let's remember, let's not be putting fear in the population when we don't even know if some of this stuff is happening. Let's take a look at what we've got on our plate now. Let's deal with it, and let's do what we need to do, and let's be responsible legislators and make sure that when we get out, we don't just kick this can forward, that we deal with it in this budget cycle. And maybe we can't deal with all of it, but we can certainly deal with a good share of it, and we need to be responsible and do that. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members.
Senator Murphy, we have 4 more on the list, and I'm going to ask you to please all be 1 to 2 minutes maximum so we can wrap up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Greenman, we meet again. We have a long history of work together, and it is so exquisitely painful that we are at this precipice again. Senator Draheim mentioned that he feels for me, and I appreciate that, but I want to remind him and everybody here that the job of balancing this budget is not mine, but ours. And I have faith in our ability. However, the uncertainty and the chaos coming from DC is causing me a great deal of sleepless nights and a lot of concern about the people of Minnesota. Senator Bolden did a great job of, describing who gets their coverage through medical assistance. It is a feature of the state's Health and Human Services budget. And I served in the House with Representative Emmer and Representative Finseth, and I believe they were in the legislature when we had this fight over general assistance medical care and the eventual expansion of medical assistance for a group of people who were very sick and very poor, and they cost the state a lot of money. And so I was surprised when they took the vote that they did on that budget resolution, knowing the impact that it could have on medical assistance. So I just want to say that I understand and appreciate that we have the job to do, and we're in the Finance Committee right now getting ready for a forecast and then the eventual budget setting that we need to do. As I talked with people in counties yesterday, they are, of course, talking about the things that they prepared for at the end of last year that they want to talk about at this legislature. But what we are seeing is potential impacts to the state's budget coming from Washington, D.C., wash away or swamp, if you will, their concerns when it comes to human services and what they are able to do. But I think we have to remember, and Representative Senator Draheim asked the question about the expansion. Who's in that expansion? As Cal Ludeman said when he was the commissioner, they are the sickest of the sick and the poorest of the poor of Minnesotans. They are homeless veterans. They are people with mental health diseases, substance abuse disorder, chronic conditions, and if their care is cut because we can't afford it anymore, because we lose the federal match. And I think the expansion takes, we receive 90% of the costs for that population of people. If we cut 40% of that and we don't have the revenue here in the state of Minnesota to replace it, they'll lose their coverage. And what that means is because they're very sick, they'll go to our hospitals, but our hospitals will not get paid. They will go to our clinics, but our clinics will not get paid, or they will not get care. All of those things have an impact, a human impact and a fiscal impact. And when I think about especially our rural hospitals and our rural clinics and the financial pressure they're already experiencing, these potential cuts coming from DC have a significant potential impact on healthcare delivery, especially in greater Minnesota, where they're already struggling. So I am, you named right, worried about this, and am not willing to let DC do this without a fight because it's so important to our state's economy, to our rural economy, to the people who work in rural communities, to the people who live all across the state of Minnesota, regardless of geography. We're gonna see a wash of increased healthcare costs for the people who still have healthcare, because that's how we cost shift. They will experience that, and we'll see a loss of coverage and care for people who need it the most. And I just think we have to be eyes wide open about that, along with the numbers that come with the decisions that we're going to make to balance the budget for the next 2 years and into the next 4 years. Thank you very much.
Senator Mohammed, please keep it short, everyone.
I will. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, MMB, for this presentation. And I think it's really important for folks to know federal funds make up 1/3 of the state's budget. And as we think about balancing our budget this year, it is almost impossible to do that if this resolution passes at the Senate. And I know we're talking ifs and buts, but Congress passed it. And the president is signaling to the Senate and telling them that they absolutely should. And there are so many cuts in this budget, but as we think about Medicaid, $880 billion cut would hit Minnesota especially hard. we are an efficient state when it comes to Medicaid spending, an efficient state, and we're being punished for that. And I hope that as we think, we are in this committee, and as we move forward and take a look at what it means for us to balance a budget that's already hard, I hope that the members in this committee on both sides of the aisle have the political courage that the members in the Human and Health Services did to send a letter to the federal government asking them not to do this, because 4 of our Republican congressional leaders all voted for this, and that's unfortunate.
Senator Friends, briefly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, members. I want to pledge Senator Dames, Senator Draheim, you have our commitment on the DFL side to ask the tough questions, and that includes going to the agencies and saying, where is it that we can save a little bit? I think we owe that to the people of Minnesota. I also think, Director, and thank you for the presentation, both of you, that we are entitled to say what is going on in Washington, what signals are they sending us, and how do we prepare for what might happen. I will share with my members of the Finance Committee a couple concerns. If we had a state senator that was operating with the type of conflict of interest of Elon Musk, we would be tearing that state senator to bits. And that would be a matter for the Subcommittee on Ethics of the Senate. So I just ask members to consider that. That's inappropriate. I would also say, Director, thank you for drawing a distinction between what's happening now, the stuff we can see and feel and touch, and what we're worried about happening. We have laid off 1,400 people at the Veterans Administration Department nationwide. That's not playing well in my district. And so that's happening now. The freezing of these funds is happening now. And I think this is going to be tough. And I think the only way we'll get through it is with some bipartisan recognition. If we're going to have to make cuts, they're going to have to be shared across the state and across the country. And I just want to end with this, which I hope everybody on this committee can agree with. One thing every single American would say is, do not cut taxes for people that are already wealthy. We can talk about our federal deficit, Senator Gruenhagen, and I agree with you, $1 trillion is a lot of money. But we can't go around cutting taxes for people that make a lot of money or have a lot of money. There is not a Minnesotan who wants to see that, and the state budget should reflect that. And I look forward to the work with all of you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Friends. And I scheduled this hearing because we're ready to begin building our state budget, and we have some very difficult challenges ahead. And I guess I'm deeply concerned about the scope and the nature of this problem. It's nothing like we've ever seen before. This impacts on the state government. You know, when we're talking about the Medicaid patients and all the discussion was how would the impact on the patients? Well, those patients are going to hospitals and clinics that are struggling to keep their doors open. And I think we're going to have multiple impacts. And my fear about this is today's discussion was simply on impacts of federal budget cuts that are going to affect the state budget. But there's so many other things happening at the same time. If we have these tariffs and how great the tariffs are, we don't know the scope of it, but we do know it does slow down the economy, increase prices and so on. And if you deport millions of people who are working in our farm fields or working in our factories, that has an impact. And if we lay off millions of federal employees, all those things together, it's the chaos and the uncertainty plus all those other impacts that may not directly affect the state budget, but they affect the state economy. And that could throw us all into another thing when state revenues drop off sharply. So I guess the issue I have concerns about is all of the chaos, all of the confusion, the uncertainty. I mean, any business, any state agency, anybody else trying to run a business and trying to find out when they don't know if they're going to get paid or not. I think that's where I'm really concerned, because these federal numbers, if any of these things happen, even just the Medicaid ones, it's not going to throw Minnesota's state economy into a tailspin. It's going to throw 50 state economy budgets into a tailspin and the economy. So I think this is an unusual time. We have to start now putting our budget together, but I want to make sure all our members are very aware of this underlying or overlapping or everything else impact, which could make our problem 4 or 5 times more difficult than it is now. And with that, I want to thank Director Mingy and Mr. Greenman for the presentation. We'll be talking about this more. And with that, I appreciate your time. And
Mr. Chair, I had my hand up 10 minutes ago. I just got a brief comment.
Senator Gruenhagen, we can continue talking later.
Well, one of my comments was, I'm beginning to like this committee. Would you please request me being on it?
Okay. We have a lot of people today who wanted to talk a lot, and with that, thank you for being here today, though.
Yeah, well, I feel
You and the
censored.
other members of the Health and Human Services. With that, this meeting's adjourned. This meeting's adjourned.